"Move again, old man, and I swear I'll put you on the ground." The voice cracked across the memorial yard with all the sharp confidence of youth pretending to be authority. Cadet Ryan Cole stood beside the olive-drab Humvee with his training pistol leveled inches from the old man's temple, his finger rigid along the trigger guard as the afternoon wind whipped across Camp Barrett's western training grounds. Around them, a cluster of Marine cadets watched with smirks stretched across their faces, the glow of phone screens reflecting in mirrored sunglasses as several of them quietly recorded the confrontation. The giant American flag above the parade deck snapped violently in the coastal wind, each crack of fabric echoing through the concrete yard like distant rifle reports. The old man didn't flinch. Elias Mercer stood perfectly still beside the chain barrier that bordered the memorial garden, one weathered hand resting lightly on a faded canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. He looked small beneath the massive steel silhouette of the Marine Corps War Memorial towering behind him. Just another forgotten old veteran in a worn green field jacket and dust-covered boots. His white hair shifted in the wind. Deep lines marked his face like old scars carved by time instead of blades. But his eyes remained clear, pale blue, steady, calm in a way that felt deeply wrong to every Marine standing there. Ryan tightened his jaw. He hated that look, hated the silence even more. Most civilians panicked when confronted by armed cadets during training exercises. They apologized. They stammered excuses. This old man had done neither. 20 yards away, the loudspeaker near the drill field continued barking cadence schedules for the afternoon exercises, while helicopters somewhere beyond the ridge sent a faint rhythmic hum through the air. The entire base carried the restless energy of organized motion, boots scraping pavement, engines growling alive, distant shouted commands carried by the wind. Yet inside the growing circle around Elias Mercer, the tension felt strangely isolated, like the entire yard had narrowed into a single dangerous moment. "You deaf or something?" Ryan barked. "This is a restricted training zone. You wandered into an active anti-intruder drill." Elias slowly shifted his gaze toward the young cadet, holding the pistol. Not angry, not intimidated, just studying him with a quiet patience that somehow made Ryan feel younger than 21. "I was looking for the memorial wall," Elias said softly. His voice carried the rough gravel tone of an old smoker and desert dust. "Wrong direction," another cadet laughed. Maybe they forgot to issue him a map back in World War II. Several others snickered. One of them zoomed his phone camera closer. Ryan stepped forward and shoved Elias backward against the Humvee's steel frame. The metallic thud echoed harder than expected. "Hands where I can see them," Ryan snapped. Elias obeyed without resistance, slowly raising his weathered hands into the cold afternoon air. The movement revealed faded scars crossing his wrists and forearms beneath the sleeve of his jacket. Old scars. Thin. Pale. Not the kind earned in offices. Ryan noticed them for half a second before dismissing them completely. Behind the old man, the wind carried the scent of jet fuel from the nearby airstrip mixed with the salt-heavy Atlantic air rolling inland. Somewhere near the administration building, a bugle suddenly sounded retreat practice. The sharp notes drifted over the yard in eerie contrast to the growing humiliation unfolding beneath the memorial statue. One cadet stepped closer and kicked the old canvas bag resting near Elias's boot. "What V we got here?" he mocked. "Secret spy gear?" The bag tipped sideways onto the pavement. A tarnished compass rolled out first, then a pair of old leather gloves darkened by age. Finally, a faded Marine Recon patch slid slowly across the concrete before stopping beneath Ryan Cole's boot. The laughter around them faded almost immediately. Even the wind seemed quieter for a second. Ryan bent down slowly and picked up the patch between two fingers. The black stitching was nearly worn smooth with time, but the faded skull insignia was still visible beneath decades of dirt and sun. Ryan smirked and held it up toward the others. "Well, look at that," he sneered. "Guess. Grandpa thinks he's some kind of war hero." Ryan Cole rotated the faded Recon patch slowly between his fingers while the other cadets crowded closer around him, their earlier laughter turning sharper now that they had an audience. The afternoon sun hung low over Camp Barrett, casting long shadows across the memorial yard and turning the polished bronze statues along the walkway into dark silhouettes against the concrete. Wind pushed dry leaves across the pavement in scratching spirals around Elias Mercer's boots. The old Marine remained motionless beside the Humvee, his hands still raised exactly where Ryan had ordered them. It was the stillness that bothered them most. Not fear, not panic, just silence. Ryan smirked as he examined the cracked stitching along the patch. "Recon," he scoffed loudly enough for everyone filming to hear. "What is this supposed to be, Halloween memorabilia?" A few cadets laughed again, though weaker this time. One of them adjusted his phone camera toward Elias's face, expecting embarrassment or anger. Instead, the old man simply looked toward the giant Marine Corps flag above the administration building. The snapping fabric thundered against the steel pole in heavy gusts rolling inland from the Atlantic. The sound seemed to carry him somewhere far away for a brief moment. Ryan noticed it and stepped closer. "You think this is funny?" he demanded. "You walk into a restricted zone carrying fake military junk and expect us to salute you?" Elias slowly lowered his eyes back toward the cadet. The pale blue stare landed on Ryan with unsettling calm. "No," he said quietly. "I expect Marines to know the difference." The words hit harder than shouting would have. Several cadets shifted awkwardly. Ryan's jaw tightened immediately. The challenge buried inside the old man's voice was almost invisible, but it was there. Controlled. Precise. The kind of confidence Ryan had spent 3 years trying to fake every time instructors walked through inspection lines. He took another step forward until the muzzle of the training pistol nearly brushed Elias's cheek. "You do not get to lecture me," Ryan snapped. "You are standing on United States Marine Corps property in the middle of a security drill. I could have military police here in 2 minutes." Elias nodded once. "Then call them." The answer landed like a slap. No hesitation. No pleading. Just that same impossible calm. Wind rolled through the memorial yard again, colder now, carrying distant rotor noise from helicopters maneuvering somewhere beyond the western ridgeline. The heavy rhythmic hum vibrated faintly through the pavement beneath their boots. One cadet muttered under his breath, "This guy is nuts." Another pointed toward the old canvas bag still lying open on the ground. "Search the rest of it." Ryan crouched beside the bag without taking his eyes off Elias. Inside sat a weathered canteen, a folded field jacket faded almost gray with age, and an old brass compass scratched so deeply it looked like it had survived a war by itself. Ryan lifted the compass and shook his head. "What is this antique garbage?" Elias looked at the compass for a long moment before answering. "That compass crossed places your maps never will." The line drew quiet from the group. Even the cadets recording seemed unsure whether to laugh anymore. Ryan stood again and tossed the compass carelessly back into the bag. "You know what your problem is, old man," he said. "You think old stories still matter around here." Elias glanced toward the memorial wall 50 yards away, where rows of engraved names caught the dying sunlight. They mattered to the names carved in stone. Ryan followed his gaze for half a second before anger pushed the hesitation away. He grabbed the faded Recon patch again and held it up near Elias's face. "You expect me to believe you were Recon?" he mocked. "Half these guys on base could buy fake patches online." Elias looked directly at the insignia. For the first time since the confrontation started, something changed in his expression. Not anger. Something heavier. Older. Like a man staring at ghosts nobody else could see. His voice dropped almost to a whisper beneath the sound of the wind. That patch was not bought. The air around the Humvee suddenly felt colder. Somewhere behind the growing crowd, boots struck pavement at a fast, deliberate pace. A new figure was approaching the memorial yard. The approaching footsteps carried none of the nervous energy surrounding the cadets. They were measured, heavy, deliberate enough to cut through the restless noise of Camp Barrett like a knife through canvas. Staff Sergeant Nolan Briggs emerged from the western pathway beside the memorial wall, his desert tan utility uniform darkened with sweat beneath the late afternoon heat. He had spent the last 6 hours supervising live field exercises on the northern ridge, and exhaustion sat heavily across his broad shoulders. But the second he saw the crowd gathered around the Humvee, something in his expression hardened. The wind carried voices toward him in fragments. Mocking laughter. Ryan cold barking orders. The metallic click of a training sidearm shifting position. Briggs immediately changed direction. The memorial yard stretched wide around him as he crossed the pavement, boots grinding sharply against loose gravel blown across the concrete by the coastal wind. Bronze plaques shimmered beneath the fading sunlight beside rows of engraved Marine names stretching back through Korea, Fallujah, Hugh City, Fallujah again. Briggs barely noticed them now. His eyes locked onto the old man standing beside the Humvee. Even from 40 yards away, something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Elias Mercer stood exactly the way experienced combat Marines stood when danger was close. Weight balanced naturally. Hands relaxed. Chin slightly lowered against the wind. Not aggressive. Not defensive. Ready. The realization crawled beneath Briggs's skin before he could explain it. Ryan still had the training pistol raised when Briggs stepped into the outer edge of the crowd. What is going on here? The sharp command instantly pulled several cadets upright. Phones lowered halfway. Smirks faded. Ryan glanced back over his shoulder, but kept the pistol aimed loosely toward Elias. Unauthorized civilian in a restricted zone, Staff Sergeant, he answered confidently. Possible impersonation issue. Briggs said nothing at first. His gaze moved slowly from Ryan to the scattered contents of the old canvas bag. The compass. The gloves. The faded jacket. Then, his eyes landed on the recon patch still hanging loosely from Ryan's fingers. Briggs stopped walking. The world around him seemed to narrow. Wind roared across the memorial yard, rattling flag cables against steel poles with hollow metallic clinks. Somewhere beyond the administration building, a helicopter engine began spooling louder into the evening air. Briggs barely heard any of it. His eyes stayed fixed on the patch. The faded skull insignia was nearly erased by time, but not completely. There were details only old Marines remembered. Small things never shown in museums or recruiting posters. The angled stitching near the lower edge. The faint black thread woven through the center seam. Unofficial modifications done decades ago by recon teams operating in places the government rarely admitted existed. Briggs felt a cold knot tighten slowly in his chest. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. Ryan scoffed immediately. "From Grandpa's costume collection." A few cadets chuckled again, though uneasily now. Briggs ignored them. He stepped closer toward Elias Mercer. The old Marine finally looked directly at him for the first time. Pale blue eyes met battle-worn gray ones. For a brief second, Briggs felt the strange sensation of standing in front of someone who had already survived things he himself could barely imagine. Elias said nothing. He did not need to. Briggs noticed the scars on his wrists, the faded field jacket, the posture. Then his eyes drifted lower toward the old brass compass resting inside the open bag. Scratched across its weathered surface were two nearly invisible words worn thin by decades of use. Kisan. Briggs felt his stomach drop. The wind suddenly seemed colder against his neck. Ryan noticed the change immediately. "Staff Sergeant." Briggs slowly looked back toward the cadet still holding the pistol. His voice came out lower this time. "More careful. Cadet, lower the weapon." Ryan frowned. "Sir." Briggs kept staring at the old Marine. That was not a suggestion. Around them, the entire memorial yard had gone strangely quiet. Even the laughter was gone now. Only the sound of the flag snapping violently overhead remained. Elias Mercer still had not moved an inch. Ryan Cole did not lower the pistol. Not immediately. Pride held it in place more than authority now. The training weapon remained angled toward Elias Mercer while the evening wind swept harder through the memorial yard, rattling the line of steel flagpoles beside the parade deck. Around them, the gathered cadets exchanged uncertain glances. The mood had changed too quickly for any of them to fully understand why. A few minutes earlier it had felt like entertainment. Now it felt like standing too close to something dangerous without knowing exactly what it was. Ryan forced out a dry laugh. "With respect, Staff Sergeant, this guy walked into a restricted area carrying fake recon gear and refuses to identify himself." Briggs did not answer right away. His eyes stayed locked on Elias Mercer with growing intensity, studying every detail the younger cadets had completely missed. The old field jacket faded almost gray from decades of wear. The weathered hands steady despite the cold wind. The unnatural calm beneath pressure. Marines who had never seen combat mistook silence for weakness. Marines who had been there knew better. Briggs slowly crouched beside the open canvas bag. Gravel crunched beneath one knee as he reached toward the old brass compass resting near the gloves. Elias watched him quietly, but did not interfere. The staff sergeant lifted the compass carefully into the fading sunlight. Deep scratches covered the brass, casing like scars layered over scars. Most were meaningless marks carved by years of hard use. But one engraving near the hinge stopped Briggs cold. A call sign, faded almost smooth with age. Ghost Actual. Briggs felt a chill crawl along the back of his neck despite the humid coastal air. His breathing slowed. Somewhere deep in his memory, old stories whispered back to life. Stories traded quietly between senior Marines late at night, in smoke pits and maintenance bays. Stories about reconnaissance teams in Vietnam that officially never existed. Men who disappeared into jungle valleys for weeks at a time with no support and no guarantee of extraction. Ghost Actual. Briggs had heard the name only twice in his career, both times spoken carefully, respectfully, like a legend too dangerous to exaggerate. Ryan noticed the change in his expression. What? Briggs looked up slowly. Where did you say you found him? Near the memorial wall, Ryan answered defensively. He wandered through the outer barrier. Briggs stood again, still holding the compass. His voice lowered another level. Did he threaten anyone? Ryan hesitated. No. Did he resist orders? Another pause. No. Briggs nodded once, almost to himself. The silence around the Humvee deepened. Even the cadets filming had lowered their phones completely now. Wind rolled through the yard, carrying the distant roar of jet engines from the airstrip beyond the ridge. The sky above Camp Barrett had turned a darker shade of orange, the last sunlight reflecting off the memorial plaques lining the walkway beside them. Briggs turned the compass over one final time in his hand before looking directly at Elias Mercer. Ghost Actual, he said quietly. The words landed like a pressure wave. Several cadets frowned in confusion. Ryan blinked once. But Elias finally reacted. Barely. The old Marine's eyes shifted toward Briggs with the faintest flicker of recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. Briggs suddenly felt very aware of how many young Marines were standing in this yard, completely unaware of what they were involved in. He handed the compass back carefully. Respectfully this time. I heard stories, Briggs said. Elias took the compass without looking away from him. Stories get louder when the people who live them get quieter. Briggs exhaled slowly. Then his eyes shifted toward the recon patch still hanging from Ryan Cole's hand. Cadet, he said firmly, give that back. Ryan frowned again, stubbornness fighting visible uncertainty now. Staff Sergeant, who is this guy? Briggs stared at him for a long moment before answering. The wind snapped violently across the flag overhead as his voice finally came out low and deadly serious. I think, he said carefully, you just pointed a weapon at one of the most respected Marines this base has ever heard about. No one laughed after that. The memorial yard stood locked beneath. A strange silence while the wind rolled across the concrete in cold, uneven gusts. Ryan Cole slowly lowered the recon patch in his hand, but his pride still refused to fully retreat. The cadets around him exchanged uncertain looks, caught between embarrassment and disbelief. They had spent years hearing stories about legendary Marines, but legends belonged in documentaries and framed photographs, not standing 10 feet away in a faded field jacket beside an old Humvee. Ryan forced a scoff that sounded weaker than he intended. You are telling me this guy is some secret war hero? Briggs did not blink. I am telling you to start using your brain before your mouth destroys your career. The words landed hard. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Briggs stepped past him toward Elias Mercer. The staff sergeant's posture had changed completely now. No arrogance. No suspicion. Only the sharp, controlled caution Marines used around people they instinctively respected. Sir, Briggs said carefully, did you serve recon in Vietnam? Elias looked toward the memorial wall again before answering. A long time ago. The answer carried no pride. No performance. Just exhaustion worn smooth by decades. Briggs nodded slowly. The helicopter noise from the western ridge grew louder overhead as a pair of CH-53 helicopters moved across the coastline in the distance, their rotor wash vibrating faintly through the steel railings around the memorial garden. The evening sky had darkened into deep amber now, shadows stretching across the engraved stone beneath the giant eagle, globe, and anchor monument towering above the yard. One cadet near the back finally whispered, Ghost Actual. Another muttered, I heard instructors talk about that name during survival training. Ryan heard them too. His confidence continued slipping away piece by piece. He looked back toward Elias Mercer more carefully now, noticing details he had ignored before. The old scars crossing both hands. The faded boots worn thin by years instead of fashion. The unnatural stillness beneath pressure. Nothing about the old Marine felt fake anymore. Briggs crouched beside the canvas bag once more and gently lifted the folded field jacket resting inside. As the fabric unfolded slightly, something metallic caught the fading sunlight near the inner lining. A tarnished silver jump-wing pin. Old. Scratched. Real. Briggs inhaled sharply. Beneath the pin sat faded lettering stitched almost invisibly into the fabric collar. Mercer. The staff sergeant stared at it for several long seconds before looking back up. My God, he whispered. Ryan stepped forward despite himself. What? Briggs rose slowly to his feet, still holding the jacket. There was an operations instructor at Quantico years ago, he said quietly. Retired master gunnery sergeant. He used to tell us stories during winterfield training about a recon team that got trapped west of Key Sand during monsoon season. Elias remained silent. Wind moved through his white hair as the distant helicopter noise slowly faded beyond the coastline. Briggs continued carefully, almost like he was afraid of saying too much. He said one Marine held a jungle perimeter through an entire night while extraction birds fought weather trying to reach them. Ryan listened despite himself now. So did every cadet around the Humvee. The memorial yard had become completely still. Even the phones were gone. Briggs looked directly at Elias Mercer. He said the team survived because one man kept them alive long enough for the helicopters to find them. Elias lowered his eyes briefly toward the old compass resting in his hand. The fading sunlight reflected softly across the scratched brass surface. Most of them did, he answered quietly. The sentence carried something heavier than grief. Ryan felt a cold unease settle into his chest. For the first time since this started, he realized the old Marine was not enjoying any of this. There was no satisfaction in him. No ego. Only the tired patience of someone who had already outlived too many memories. Briggs suddenly turned toward Ryan again, his face tightening hard. Cadet, he said firmly. You are standing in front of a man Marines speak about in classrooms without even knowing if he was real. Ryan swallowed, but said nothing. Then Briggs reached slowly for the radio clipped to his vest. The movement alone changed the atmosphere instantly. Elias noticed it too. His pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. That is not necessary, he said. Briggs looked at him with complete seriousness. Respectfully, sir, he answered. I think command needs to know you are here. Staff Sergeant Briggs pulled the radio from his vest with slow, deliberate movements, like a man fully aware that a single sentence could change the entire atmosphere of a military base. The memorial yard remained frozen around him. Evening shadows stretched longer across the concrete now, crawling beneath the Humvee tires and across the engraved names lining the black granite memorial wall 50 yards away. Ryan Cole stood rigid beside the vehicle, the training pistol finally lowered completely at his side. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone now, replaced by the tight silence of someone beginning to realize he had stepped into something far beyond his understanding. Briggs pressed the radio transmit button. Static crackled sharply through the cool air. Command, this is Staff Sergeant Briggs at Memorial Sector Charlie. The response came instantly beneath bursts of radio interference. Go ahead, Briggs. Briggs hesitated for the briefest second, eyes still fixed on Elias Mercer. I need verification on a possible former Recon Marine. Ryan shifted uneasily. The cadets exchanged nervous looks again. One of them quietly stepped backward away from the Humvee, as if distance alone might somehow protect him from what was unfolding. Briggs continued carefully. Name is Elias Mercer. Silence answered him. Not ordinary silence. Dead radio silence. Static vanished completely for nearly 3 seconds. Then a different voice came over the channel. Older. Sharper. Repeat the name. Briggs swallowed once. Elias Mercer. This time the silence lasted longer. The wind roared across the memorial yard hard enough to rattle the loose chain barriers near the pathway entrance. Somewhere overhead, a jet thundered across the coastline, leaving a distant rolling growl through the darkening sky. Every cadet standing there listened now. Briggs lowered the radio slightly, but kept his thumb near the transmit button. Finally, the voice returned, quieter than before. Stand by. The channel went dead. Ryan stared at the radio. Who was that? Briggs ignored him completely. His attention remained locked on Elias Mercer, whose expression had not changed at all. The old Marine stood exactly as he had from the beginning, calm beneath the snapping flag and fading sunlight, one hand resting lightly against the old canvas bag beside his boot. The longer Briggs looked at him, the more unreal the entire situation felt. Legends were supposed to stay buried in stories. Men like this were not supposed to simply appear beside memorial walls carrying old compasses and faded patches. One of the younger cadets finally whispered, "Why would command care this much?" Briggs answered without looking away from Elias. "Because some Marines become part of the Corps itself." The words settled heavily over the group. Ryan looked toward Elias again, really looking this time. The old scars, the weathered posture, the eyes that carried too much history behind them. Ryan suddenly felt embarrassed by every word he had spoken during the last 20 minutes. His grip tightened unconsciously around the training pistol hanging uselessly at his side. Elias noticed the movement immediately. Not fear. Instinct. The old Marine's gaze dropped toward the weapon for half a second before returning calmly to Ryan's face. It was such a small reaction that none of the cadets noticed. Briggs did, and the realization chilled him even more. Even at 82 years old, Mercer still tracked threats automatically. Somewhere deep inside him, the war had clearly never ended. The radio suddenly exploded back to life. "Briggs." The voice was different now. Tight. Urgent. "Confirm immediately. Is the individual carrying a Recon insignia with black thread through the center seam?" Briggs looked toward the patch still hanging loosely from Ryan's fingers. "Affirmative." Another pause. Then voices erupted faintly in the background of the transmission. Multiple people talking at once. A chair scraping violently across a floor. Someone cursing under their breath. Ryan's face drained of color. Briggs heard another voice. "Enter the channel farther away from the microphone. Get General Hale now." The words hit the memorial yard like a pressure wave. Several cadets visibly stiffened. Even Ryan blinked hard at the name. Lieutenant General Victor Hale commanded the entire Marine Expeditionary Training Sector along the East Coast. Cadets did not hear his name casually. Briggs slowly lowered the radio again. The wind shifted colder through the yard as darkness crept across the memorial plaques behind them. Elias Mercer closed his eyes briefly, almost tired more than surprised. Then he looked toward Briggs and spoke for the first time in several minutes. "You should not have done that." Briggs stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, they are calling a 3-star general." Elias nodded once beneath the roaring flag overhead. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly why you should not have done it." The atmosphere across Memorial Sector Charlie transformed over the next 60 seconds with the terrifying speed only military command structures could create. The first sign came from the road beyond the administration building. 2 black command SUVs appeared suddenly around the corner at a speed vehicles normally never reached inside Camp Barrett. Their headlights swept across the memorial yard as they accelerated over the concrete access lane, gravel spitting beneath heavy tires. Every cadet instinctively straightened. Ryan Cole felt his stomach tighten hard inside his chest. Staff Sergeant Briggs lowered his radio slowly while watching the vehicles approach. The radio traffic exploding moments earlier had already told him enough. Somebody very high inside command had panicked. That alone was almost impossible. Marines at that level did not panic. They controlled panic. The black SUVs rolled to a sharp stop beside the memorial walkway. Before the engines fully settled, 2 senior officers stepped out wearing service uniforms beneath dark evening jackets. One was a full colonel. The other wore silver oak leaves. Neither man acknowledged the cadets. Their eyes locked immediately onto Elias Mercer standing beside the Humvee. The colonel's expression changed first. Not confusion. Recognition. Real. Recognition. He stopped walking so abruptly that the major behind him nearly collided with him. "No way," the major whispered under his breath. Elias looked genuinely uncomfortable now. The old Marine adjusted the canvas bag on his shoulders slightly, almost like a man considering escape routes rather than attention. The colonel approached slowly across the memorial pavement. Wind hammered the giant American flag overhead hard enough to shake the steel cables attached to the pole. Darkness had nearly settled across the base now, leaving the memorial yard washed in pale security lights and the amber glow spilling from nearby administration windows. The colonel stopped 6 feet from Elias Mercer. For a long moment, he said absolutely nothing. Then, quietly, almost carefully, he asked, "Ghost actual?" Elias closed his eyes for half a second before answering. Nobody has called me that in 40 years. The colonel exhaled sharply like he had just confirmed something impossible. Behind him, the major immediately snapped to attention so fast his heel struck concrete with a crack that echoed across the yard. Several cadets flinched. Ryan stared in disbelief. The colonel looked toward Briggs next. Who detained him? The question landed with cold precision. Briggs did not hesitate. Cadet Ryan Cole initiated the stop during anti-intruder exercises, sir. Ryan felt every pair of eyes turn toward him instantly. His throat tightened. The colonel slowly shifted his gaze toward the young cadet, still holding the training pistol at his side. The disappointment in the officer's face somehow felt worse than anger. Son, he said quietly, do you have any idea who you aimed that weapon at? Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The wind rolled hard through the memorial yard again, carrying the distant thunder of another helicopter approaching from somewhere beyond the coastline. Then the radio on the colonel's shoulder erupted sharply. Command vehicle arriving in 30 seconds. Every Marine present stiffened instantly. Briggs looked toward the road. The colonel's posture changed completely. The major swallowed hard and adjusted his cover nervously. Even Elias Mercer looked away toward the access lane with visible exhaustion in his eyes. The sound reached them first. Heavy engines, multiple vehicles, headlights spilled across the memorial statues seconds later as a larger convoy turned into the sector. Black Suburbans, military police escort motorcycles, base security vehicles. Ryan felt his pulse spike violently in his neck. Oh my God, one cadet whispered. The convoy stopped near the flagpole with precise, controlled motion. Doors opened immediately. Marines in dress uniforms moved first, scanning the area automatically before stepping aside. Then Lieutenant General Victor Hale emerged from the center vehicle. Every Marine in the memorial yard snapped to attention on instinct alone. Even the wind seemed quieter for a second. General Hale was older now, silver hair beneath his cover, deep lines carved across his face by decades of command. But the moment his eyes found Elias Mercer beside the Humvee, something inside the three-star general visibly broke. He stopped walking. Completely stopped. The hardened command presence vanished from his expression, replaced by stunned disbelief and something dangerously close to emotion. Ryan watched the most powerful Marine he had ever seen slowly remove his gloves with trembling hands. Then General Hale took one step forward into the cold evening wind and spoke with a voice suddenly stripped of rank entirely. Elias. The single word drifted across the memorial yard softer than the wind, yet every Marine standing there felt its weight instantly. General Victor Hale did not sound like a commanding officer anymore. He sounded like a man staring directly into a memory he never expected to see again. Elias Mercer looked at him quietly beneath the snapping flag overhead. The pale security lights around Memorial Sector Charlie reflected faintly across the old Marine's weathered face, while the convoy engines idled behind the gathered officers in low mechanical rumbles. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Elias gave the smallest nod. Victor. The reaction was immediate. Marines who had spent entire careers around General Hale had never heard anyone address him by his first name. Ryan Cole felt the blood drain from his face completely. Around him, cadets stood frozen beside the Humvee, too stunned now to even shift their weight. The three-star general took another slow step forward. His eyes moved across Elias Mercer's old field jacket, the worn canvas bag, the faded recon patch now resting carefully in Staff Sergeant Briggs's hands. The hard command mask General Hale wore in every briefing room and battlefield vanished piece by piece. In its place came something far rarer. Respect. Deep enough to hurt. I thought you were dead, Hale said quietly. Elias gave a tired half-smile that barely touched his face. Almost was. Couple times. A faint nervous laugh escaped the major standing nearby before he caught himself immediately. Nobody else moved. The evening wind rolled colder through the memorial yard, carrying salt air inland from the Atlantic coastline and rattling loose leaves across the concrete beneath polished black boots. General Hale slowly removed his cover. The motion sent a visible shock through every Marine present. A three-star general did not uncover outdoors casually. Not in uniform. Not on a live base. But Victor Hale no longer seemed aware of anyone else around him. His eyes never left Elias Mercer. "Sir." The colonel began carefully. Hale raised one hand, without looking away from Elias. Silence returned instantly. Then the general noticed something near Ryan Cole's side. The training pistol still hanging from the cadet's trembling hand. The atmosphere changed immediately. The warmth disappeared from Hale's expression so fast it felt like watching a storm front roll across open water. His eyes hardened with terrifying precision. "Cadet," he said quietly. Ryan snapped upright, so hard his boots scraped concrete. "Sir." Hale stepped closer. "Were you the one holding that weapon on him?" Ryan tried to answer, but his throat tightened completely. Briggs finally spoke instead. "Yes, sir." General Hale stared at Ryan for several long seconds while the wind thundered against the massive American flag above them. The memorial lights cast sharp shadows across his face now, deepening the lines carved there by decades of command. When he finally spoke again, his voice dropped low enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "Do you understand who stood in front of you tonight?" Ryan swallowed hard. "No, sir." Hale nodded once. "That is obvious." The words hit harder than shouting ever could have. Elias shifted slightly beside the Humvee. "Victor," he said quietly, "they are kids. Let it go." General Hale looked back toward him with visible disbelief. "Let it go," he repeated softly. "Elias, you pulled me out of a jungle valley after my entire recon element collapsed around me." The memorial yard went completely silent again. Even the officers standing beside the convoy seemed frozen now. Hale took another slow breath before continuing. "You carried 3 Marines through monsoon mud for 6 miles, while taking incoming fire the entire way." Ryan felt his knees weaken slightly. The old stories Briggs mentioned suddenly became horrifyingly real. Hale looked directly at the cadets gathered around the Humvee. "Every instructor on this base teaches lessons shaped by men like him," he said firmly. "Most of you just never realized the names were real." Elias lowered his eyes toward the memorial wall beside them. The security lights reflected faintly across the engraved names stretching into darkness. "Too many names out there were real," he answered quietly. General Hale looked at the wall too. For the first time since arriving, his posture softened again. Then slowly, deliberately, in front of every Marine standing in Memorial Sector Charlie, the 3-star general came to full attention. The sharp crack of polished heels against concrete echoed across the yard. Ryan stared in disbelief as Victor Hale raised his hand in a perfect Marine salute toward the old recon veteran standing beside the Humvee. The salute hung in the cold evening air like something sacred. Every Marine in Memorial Sector Charlie stood frozen beneath the roaring flag as Lieutenant General Victor Hale held his hand locked at his brow toward the old recon veteran beside the Humvee. The convoy engines idled quietly in the background. Security lights cast long pale reflections across the memorial wall and the polished black. Vehicles lined beside the curb. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Ryan Cole stared at the scene with a numb expression, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. A 3-star general was saluting the same old man he had shoved against military steel less than 30 minutes earlier. Elias Mercer looked almost uncomfortable beneath the attention. Slowly, with the calm precision of habit burned into muscle memory decades ago, he returned the salute. The movement was not sharp anymore. H had taken some speed from him, but dignity remained untouched. General Hale lowered his hand carefully. His eyes stayed fixed on Elias for another long moment before finally drifting toward the memorial wall beside them. Rows upon rows of engraved Marine names stretched through the darkness beneath the floodlights. Men who never came home. Men whose stories survived only in stone and fading photographs. Hale spoke quietly without turning around. "I looked for your name for years." Elias rested one weathered hand against the strap of his old canvas bag. "A lot of people stopped looking after the war." Hale shook his head once. "Not me." The answer carried enough weight to silence even the wind for a second. Staff Sergeant Briggs stood several feet away beside the cadets, saying nothing. The younger Marines around him looked different now, smaller somehow. The arrogance that had filled the memorial yard earlier had completely vanished, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Perspective. Ryan slowly looked down at the training pistol still hanging uselessly in his hand. Shame hit him harder with every passing second. He thought about the words he had used. The mocking tone. The way Elias Mercer never once raised his voice despite everything. Ryan suddenly understood the difference between authority and character, and the realization burned hotter than humiliation ever could. General Hale finally turned toward the cadets. His expression was calm again now, but there was iron beneath it. "Every one of you will remember tonight for the rest of your careers," he said firmly. "Not because you met a legend, because you almost failed to recognize what honor looks like when it stands in front of you." No one answered. Hale looked directly at Ryan next. "Cadet Cole." Ryan snapped upright instantly. "Sir." Hale's voice lowered. "A weapon does not make you dangerous. Judgment does." Ryan swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." The young cadet slowly stepped toward Elias Mercer then. His boots sounded painfully loud against the concrete in the silence surrounding the memorial yard. He stopped directly in front of the old Marine, his face pale beneath the floodlights. For several seconds he could not find words at all. Then finally, quietly, he said, "Sir, I am sorry." Elias studied him with the